Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition. We turned out a poem 696, Their Height in Heaven Comforts Not. This idea of the antecedent to the pronoun there, as in whose height in heaven? Well, of course, we're speaking now about those who have passed, the dead, if you will. Now, we, in many ways with this study, are back to poem 489. You guys will maybe remember when we did this study. We pray to heaven. We pray of heaven. Relate when neighbors die. At what o'clock to heaven they fled. Who saw them? Wherefore fly? Is heaven a place? A sky? A tree? Location's narrow way is for ourselves. Unto the dead there's no geography, but state endowal, focus, where omnipotence fly. Now, we're back to Emily as fallibilist, epistemological fallibilist. Emily as Platonist, we might even say as well. Our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've worked through our set of introductory comments. We talked about our big five in Room 303, about any text that we study. We ask from five perspectives. There's obviously more, but five are important to us. What does this text say about epistemology, what you can know? And we commented that you epistemologically can have three positions that you can take about any given thing you want to say you know. I am absolutely certain I'm right, you're wrong. Of course, we have obvious problems with that kind of thing. There is no, the complete opposite position, there is no way to know anything. But of course, the moment that you say that, you seem to be stating something that you feel like you know. And in that moment, you have performed what we call the performative contradiction. And therefore, the relativist position folds in on itself. Which leads then to a third position, which is Emily's position, fallibilism. Now, what do we mean by this? A simple observation. I can say about any given principle, I think I know. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. It's that I could be wrong that will make it such a powerful thing. Fundamentally, that is the scientific endeavor. And Emily was constantly playing the game. She'll even say, again in this poem, I do not know. That will be of some significance for us. I'm also hopeful that you've worked through the previous 695 poems. We've been working together now. We just finished with 695 as if the sea should part. And if you've been doing that work with us, then you will know that this is not new. Emily is constantly challenging herself, and obviously us, to give some consideration to what it is we really know. The idea of afterlife, the idea of heaven will be challenged here. I want you to notice the phrase "to me" repeated twice in this poem. And this is one of Emily's most personal poems. She will use me or my 4 times. She will use the pronoun I 5 times. She is speaking for herself in this poem. Now, the scholar priest will point out that there are other scholars who have weighed in on this topic. Ruth Miller, for example, will see the acid verse, she calls it, of this poem as Emily taking the opposite view from Thomas Brown's, who asserted in his Religio Medici, we've given full lectures on this at LearnStrong.net, quote, this is what Brown says, I believe that the souls of men know neither contrary nor corruption, that the souls of the faithful as they leave earth take possession of heaven. Priest goes on to say, but to Emily this glory of the faithful is no comfort because she can't see it. We would have been better off, she claims, if we had been left with just this imperfect life. It is all supposition and perhaps across the frontier of death that leaves us feeling insecure. This world's wealth, to finish with Priest, may be smaller, but I had counted it and experienced it until it pleased me with narrow vision, Emily seems to be saying, better than the larger values of some possible heaven. For however true that show or display of the heaven may be, the evidence for it is such that we can only timidly say, I don't know. What can we actually know? Emily will play the game. Their height in heaven comforts not, their glory not to me. 'Twas best imperfect as it was. I'm finite. I can't see the house of supposition, the glimmering frontier that skirts the acres of perhaps to me shows insecure. The wealth I had contented me. If 'twas a meaner size than I had counted it until it pleased my narrow eyes, better than larger values that show however true. This timid life of evidence keeps pleading, I don't know. Now, there is, I think, a couple of different ways to read this. One of these is Emily's just being straight up honest. There's so little, she says, that I can understand. There is another reading of this. The tone is a little bit more defiant, bellicose, and she seems to be saying, I don't need to know. What is it that she'll say, parting is all we know of sorrow and all we need of hell, in my life closed twice. A similar kind of observation could be made here. Notice she'll begin with the idea of height in heaven. Heaven, of course, takes us back to 694, the heaven. We mentioned in 135 poems she references heaven. Comforts not. In other words, I don't get any comfort from the idea of heaven, which by itself, on its face, is already a fairly kind of outlandish, dare we say it, blasphemous position for her to take. Their glory, right, those who have achieved glory in heaven, basically is nothing to me. She uses the word naught. You'll remember this from 443 with miles on miles of naught, and 458 just infinite of naught. In other words, doesn't mean anything to me because I can't experience it. All I can do is imagine it. 'Twas best imperfect as it was. This idea of imperfect is, I think, central to this poem. And then she'll say it, I'm finite. I can't see. Now, of course, this takes us back to our study of Plato and the Republic in Republic Book 7. We've given full lectures on all the Republic at learnstrong.net, but you'll remember that when you come out into the light of the sun, as you are dragged out into the light of the sun, that you are immediately, what do we say, blinded by the light, and of course you can't see. And to that degree, when you're inside of the cave, all you can see are shadows on a wall, and to that degree, as Plato argues, you don't really have much insight anyway. And then when you come out into the light of the sun, it takes a while to grow accustomed to the light. Notice Emily's saying here, there's a whole lot I can't see. Let me tell you what I can't see. I can't see the house of supposition. It's a brilliant construction. Is she speaking specifically about heaven? Is she speaking about the notion of faith or the church? The glimmering frontier. Wow, think about that line as it references the time she's writing this poem, we believe roughly 1863. Right during the moment in time when all kinds of expansion is starting to happen out to our part of the country and out here in the frontier, that skirts the acres of perhaps. She uses, of course, this word perhaps in 38 of her poems. Its first use, you'll remember, was from poem 70. I think acres of perhaps is one of the central phrases of Emily Dickinson in her work. Why? Because she's constantly pushing against the bounds. Here she uses this word skirt to just tangentially, asymptotically, tangentially touch. And I think this is the key for Emily. She's brilliantly curious about wanting to know more and more stuff. It's always about perhaps in the poem 694, you'll remember, it was, we almost cease to fear. She says, the house of supposition, the glimmering frontier that skirts the acres of perhaps, to me, shows insincere. Before it was imperfect, now it's insecure. Insecure. This idea of how much can I really hold on to, right? I didn't mean to say insincere. That would have been a poor statement for Emily's meaning here. It's not that she's insincere. It's more like, I can't hold on to it. I can't be sure of it. What can I be certain of? Consider the fact that Emily's contemporary is Henry David Thoreau, who wrote in Walden, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately to front only the, what does he call it, essential facts of life. That essential facts of life. What are those things? Well, you would think at his age he'd already know those things. And he says, I wasn't sure that I actually knew what those were. Here, it is for Emily insecure. I don't know what I can hold on to. Then she comes back to it. The wealth I had contented me. Now, how do you read this, the wealth? Are we talking about Emily and her inspiration to write these poems? Are we talking about Emily and her belief that all she needs is this life and not something post afterlife or whatever? She says, I was contented enough. Notice we go from comforts not to contented me, and then we'll get to better here in a second. If 'twas a meaner size, in other words, my little slice of heaven is all I need. We've already seen this in so many poems previous. Then I had counted it until it pleased my narrow eyes. So we're back again to the idea of I can't see. The narrow eyes, in other words, not expansive, but narrow. Again, the fallibilist position. There's not a lot I know, but I will admit the possibility that I could be wrong with the things that I do know. Then she says it, better than larger values. So we go from wealth to larger values that show, however true, and then she'll say it, this timid life. She'll use timid in 20 of her poems of evidence. Notice it is capitalized. Evidence she uses in 501. We'll see it again in 957 and in 968 and in 1643. I just want to call attention to it when she uses it in 976. It is compelling the way she uses it in 976. She says, death is a dialogue between the spirit and the dust. Dissolve, says death. The spirit, sir, I have another trust. Death doubts it, argues from the ground. The spirit turns away, just laying off for evidence an overcoat of clay. Her use of evidence here, and especially that it's capitalized, this timid life of evidence keeps pleading. You'll remember pleading from 144, 223, 582, and 627. Keeps pleading, dash, I don't know. Now, you'll remember I don't know from 127. Do you remember when she says it in 79? Going to heaven. I don't know when, pray, do not ask me how. Indeed, I'm too astonished to think of answering you. Going to heaven, how dim it sounds, and yet it will be done as sure as flocks go home at night unto the shepherd's arm. Perhaps you're going too. Who knows? If you should get there first, save just a little space for me, close to the one I lost. The smallest robe will fit me, and just a bit of crown. See, notice how these poems read so well together. For you know we do not mind our dress when we are going home. I'm glad I don't believe it, for it would stop my breath, and I'd like to look a little more at such a curious earth. I'm glad they did believe it, whom I have never found, since the mighty autumn afternoon I left them in the ground. It is amazing as we get in now, nearly 700 poems into our study, how these poems build off of each other, and I hope that you're enjoying that study as well. What are we going to do with a poem like this at 2A? Well, I think our argument is that what one can see is often better than what one can simply imagine. And in this regard, she says, this is all that I need. Now, you can read this poem literally, I only need this life, I don't need any expectation of heaven. Or you can read it as more an epistemological statement. I'm willing to just accept the little bit that I know, and I'm going to hold on to that until somebody can prove it otherwise to me. In other words, evidence from me is going to be experiential, maybe is another way to say it. At 2B, I'm very interested in the personal pronouns of me and my, used 4 times in I. This is one of the more personal poems that we've read of Emily's. Almost a statement or a credo, if you will, of what it is that she will say she can hold on to or believe. At 3A, well, I mean, think of all her contemporaries. It's amazing that Emily is writing a poem like this right at the same time that Thoreau is writing Walden, that Emerson is writing his classic essays, and that Walt Whitman is writing poems for Leaves of Grass. I mean, it's kind of amazing to find all of those poems, all of those different writers will be playing a similar kind of game. We obviously mentioned the Brown quote as well. Finally, at 3B, how much evidence to own a poem like this? How much evidence do you need? And do you think that the fallibilist position is the best epistemological position most of the time? I hope Emily's challenging philosophically. Thank you.